The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. A summary. Remember, the purpose of these summaries is to serve as a precursor so that as we read the play in class, you better understand the plot and the main characters and can therefore pay closer attention to the conversation and elements as we encounter them. But it is by no means complete, so minor characters will be missing as well as some of the other thematic elements. Make sure you are attentive as we read it in class. Alright, starting off. The story begins with Bassanio coming to his friend Antonio. Now, Bassanio wants to woo this wealthy lady named Portia, and in order to do so, he feels he needs money to impress her and to spend on her. He has spent all of his money, as well as much of the money that he has borrowed from Antonio previously. But he says, and he compares it to an archer with his arrows, that, okay, he didn't watch where the first arrow went, but that the second time he will. And you shoot an arrow off in the same direction and follow it more closely, then you can find that arrow and the previous one. So he means to say that he'll figure out how he somehow lost the money the first time in gambling or misfortune, and then get it all back and pay Antonio back. Antonio's a good friend and has no problem with the idea of lending him more money, but unfortunately all of his all of his assets are tied up in ships that are currently at sea. So he doesn't actually have any money currently to give to him. But since his credit is good, he decides to appeal to a moneylender. Now we need to understand something about the Elizabethan era at this time. For them, money was something to be spent and enjoyed. So therefore, charging interest was abhorrent, and it was actually considered a sin. So if you needed to borrow money, you would have to go to a Jew. Now, Jews were almost forced by circumstances to become the public's moneylenders because they were deprived by law of holding almost any other profession. So they're kind of placed into this odd situation where the only way that they can make money is by lending it and charging interest, and yet they're despised for doing that. So Antonio goes to Shylock to ask for a loan. Shylock, who has a bad history with Antonio because Shylock is a Jew and Antonio as a Christian is like repeatedly putting him down and calling him names, as is the general custom at the time. Everyone looks down on the Jewish people. Hates Antonio. So he thinks that he can use this opportunity to his advantage and get revenge on him. So he says, you know what? I won't even charge you interest. Let's just say, hypothetically, that if you don't pay me back by the time it's due, I get to take a pound of your flesh. Isn't that ridiculous? That's so silly. Bassanio's like, this sounds like a horrible idea, and Antonio, I don't think you should go through with this. Antonio's like, what? That's a great deal. I have a ton of money. It's just in ships abroad, but it'll be fine. I'll definitely be able to pay before the due date, and there's no interest. Like, this is as good as I could have hoped. So he accepts the deal, and he gives Bassanio the money, who leaves with his friend Gratiano to go to Belmont. Now, in Belmont, we have the Miss Portia, who is being wooed by many suitors, and she has her handmaiden Nerissa. Now, Portia's father has died, but before doing so, he set up this elaborate test for suitors. So he wanted to ensure that whoever married Portia was worthy. And she is following through on what her father's wishes are. So there's 3 chests that the men get to choose from, but there are some conditions. So there's 1 chest of lead, 1 of silver, and 1 of gold, and they each say something different on the outside as well. What they choose helps us understand and helps depict the character of the man who is choosing. So for instance, one man who chooses gold, because it says something about what all men desire, assumes that that's relating to Portia. So he's like, that's what it is. It's the wrong chest, and on the inside is a mocking verse that makes fun of him. One of the men who chooses silver, because it says that you will get what you desire, likewise encounters not what he expected and is embarrassed and has to go home. Now, a couple of the other conditions is that if a man chooses incorrectly, he has to leave immediately. He cannot tell anyone else about his experience, so he can't share, like, oh, don't pick the gold. And they are forbidden to ever wed, so they have to remain bachelors for the rest of their lives. Now, when Bassanio does show up, Portia actually really likes him, and she wants him to postpone picking because she's hoping that they'll spend time together, and she's worried that he'll pick the wrong one and then have to leave. But, of course, as in most Shakespeare comedies, all ends well, and he does choose the correct one, and all is happy. Now, this is revealed in some back and forth scenes. So meanwhile, we also find out that Shylock has a daughter named Jessica. She is not very happy living under her father's rule or how he governs her, and she actually falls in love with and then runs away with a Christian named Lorenzo. So much is involved in that subplot as well, but she, in a scene where she disguises herself as a boy, she converts to Christianity, steals a whole bunch of her father's money and his jewels, and runs away. Shylock is not only very upset about his daughter leaving, but he attributes this again to the mistreatment of the Christians, and so it just adds to his fuel for revenge. It's important, however, that the audience doesn't actually see his reaction to when he first finds out she's gone, because it could inspire sympathy, and we don't want him to be viewed with that much empathy yet, or really ever, since he's not supposed to be the good guy of the play. However, we see it through the eyes of another character who's just retelling it to the audience. Later on, though, he does express his concerns and his frustrations about what's happening in his famous "Hath Not a Jew" speech. And in that, he's appealing to the humanity of Jews and how they're not different from any other people. If you cut us, will we not bleed, etc. But then he ends it with, would we not want revenge? And so it brings it back to kind of his monstrous personality and his priorities. Okay. At the same time, they find out that Antonio's ships are lost at sea. And this is perfect opportunity for Shylock to take his revenge on everything he's personally experienced and then his daughter's abandonment, and he has Antonio arrested. Meanwhile, in Belmont, Portia is getting married to Bassanio, and of course his best friend fell in love with her handmaiden, so they're getting married as well, Nerissa and Gratiano. And in the midst of this wedding, or immediately afterwards, a letter is brought explaining that Antonio has been arrested, that Shylock is demanding the pound of flesh. And Bassanio says, I have to return and help my friend. He's going to take Gratiano with him. And his wife's like, of course, yes, you must, but here's money. Take a bunch of my money with you, twice what you need, and pay Shylock Antonio's debt. They also both give their husbands a ring, saying this is symbolic of my love and of our unity and our loyalty, and don't ever, ever part with it. Part with your life before you part with this ring. And the men are like, of course, absolutely. Nothing means more to me than that. Okay, then they leave. Little do they know, though, that also Portia and Nerissa leave, and they seek the counsel of Portia's cousin, Valerio, who's a lawyer. So they think he might be able to help. Okay, here's the courtroom. Yes, I know, enjoy my artistic abilities. All right, so this is the dramatic center of the play. We have the Duke of Venice. Now, Shylock is refusing the extra money. Bassanio comes in with double the money. Shylock's not interested. He wants the pound of flesh. The Duke is willing to save Antonio, but because Venice is a center trading port for really that whole side of the globe, it would set a really bad precedence. It would basically mean we don't honor our laws, you can do whatever you want, and chaos could ensue. So since the contract was legally binding and has been followed to the letter, there's really nothing he can do. His hands are tied. Bellario was unable to attend, but they don't know that. So Portia actually comes as Bellario. She's disguised as a boy, and then her lawyer's clerk is really Nerissa. So both of them have come disguised as men to help with the case. Now it's at this point that Portia delivers her famous mercy speech. The quality of mercy is not strained. And she appeals to Shylock, saying, yes, you are in the right. You have won, the contract could be followed, but could you not also show mercy? And explains the value of that and how that could be upheld, and then he could be exonerated. Shylock refuses. So she says, all right, yes, you're in the right. The court must give you your pound of flesh. So at the very moment that Shylock's about to stick Antonio with a knife, she says, wait, there's a flaw. The bond only allows for you to remove the flesh, not the blood. So if Shylock were to drop any blood of Antonio's in cutting out his flesh, then all of Shylock's lands and goods are forfeited. Shylock realizes he's been defeated and tries to back down and accept the money, but it's too late at this point. Portia pronounces that none should be given, and that since he attempted to take the life of a citizen, that his property is forfeited, half to the government and half to Antonio, since he tried to kill Antonio, and that his life is at stake now. Before Shylock can even beg for his own life, though, the Duke pardons it and says he doesn't have to die. And Antonio asks for his share of the money in use. So that means he'll reserve the principal amount and only take the income until Shylock's death, at which point that principal will be given to Lorenzo and Jessica. So basically everything he owns after his death will have to go to them, minus right now half going to the government. Shylock is also forced to convert to Christianity and to make a will, or a deed of gift, that bequeaths his entire estate to Lorenzo and Jessica. Now, amidst all of this, Bassanio does not recognize his wife, nor does Gratiano recognize his. But afterwards, they feel so indebted to them for saving Antonio's life. Like, what can we give you? What can we pay you? You've done so much for us. And at first they say nothing, and then she's like, you know what? Actually, that ring. I would like your gloves and your ring. He gives him the gloves, no problem, but is like, no, I really can't give you the rings. Portia pretends to be offended, and Antonio steps in and is like, come on, Bassanio, like, he saved my life. Please, this is the least you could do. I'm sure your wife will understand. So he finally, begrudgingly hands over the ring. Nerissa gets Gratiano to do the same. So then they all return to Belmont separately, and the girls have a blast berating their husbands, like, where's the ring? How could you ever? I thought we just got married. We talked about this, our loyalties, and they're groveling and begging and sorry and apologetic. And then the girls are like, it was us the whole time, just kidding, here's the ring, look, we actually have them. And as with most of Shakespeare's comedies, we end with many couples and happiness in marriage, except for Shylock. So 3 couples married. Oh, Antonio, turns out all his ships were found. They're not lost at sea, so he's wealthy again and good to go. And Shylock is the odd one out with his land, property, and money stripped from him, his daughter converted to Christianity, and then him forced likewise to do the same.